Hello everybody and welcome to this video. It's the continuation in my series on A-Level English Literature. Everything you see in this video comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to A-Level English Literature, which is available at mrbruff.com or amazon.co.uk for just £4.99, written by Kerry Lewis aka Mrs. Spag on Twitter. It's an absolutely phenomenal guide that's going to help you with your A-level and even at degree level study of English literature. So we spent the last few videos looking at literary movements in British literature, and there are other literary movements to explore. Some overlap with another period and others occur abroad. So I'm going to go through some of the others, but do know that everything you see in this video is written down in the ebook. Transcendentalism, 1836 to 1860, part of the American literary and philosophical movement that began in Boston in America, led by Ralph Waldo Emerson, this guy, and Amos Bronson Alcott, this guy. Now, like British Romantics, Transcendentalists were nonconformists. They believed in the rights of the individual to follow truth, even if it went against established laws or customs. They rejected traditional authority and built a foundation for the abolition of slavery, the civil rights and conscientious objector movements. Transcendence involves following your intuition to gain a new understanding of the world and your place as a moral, idealistic person. And Emerson promoted the idea of humans having a universal soul which provides intuition. This was seen as a privileged form of knowledge, more important than intellect. Emerson wrote essays about transcendentalism. Transcendental elements can also be seen in Walden by Henry David Thoreau. Other members of the group include Bronson Alcott, Margaret Fuller, F. H. Hedge, Theodore Parker, and George Ripley. Transcendentalism influenced Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, and Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick. There's Mrs. Spag on the screen. I meant to put this slide 2 back, but no mind, there she is. She's not part of the Transcendentalism movement, but she is a fantastic writer in her own right. Okay, the next one is realism, 1820 to 1920. Now, realism is something you hear a lot about, I think, and it's important to understand really what it is about. Literary realism aims to describe things as they actually are, as opposed to in a stylized or romanticized way. The literary critic Ian Watt, in The Rise of the Novel, published in 1957, believes that this movement began with the early 18th century novel, with its founding fathers being Daniel Defoe in 1660 to 1731, who of course wrote Robinson Crusoe, Samuel Richardson, who wrote 3 novels, Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, Clarissa or The History of a Young Lady, and The History of Sir Charles Grandison, and Henry Fielding, author of Tom Jones and incidentally founder of London's first police force, the Bow Street Runners. Now, these novels appealed to a new middle-class reading public who enjoyed reading realistic depictions of ordinary people and their relationships with each other. The Victorian 19th century novel Middlemarch by George Eliot has been categorised as a work of realism, partly because it describes people's reactions to the Reform Bill of 1832, which gave the vote to more people living in towns, the railways, and developments in medical science. Realism continued mainly in America and lasted until the end of the 19th century. Its popularity began to go down because it was felt that it dwelt too much on the negative side of life, and other criticism came from authors like Henry James, who said that there was too much focus on character and not enough on plot. Naturalism then, 1870 to 1920. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution influenced naturalistic writers who believed that a person's environment shaped his or her character. Both realism and naturalism describe things as they are, but naturalism also tries to scientifically analyse what influences a person's actions. Naturalism is another literary movement in which pessimism is a key characteristic. In fact, a criticism of this movement was that it focused too much on vice and misery. The harshness of life and the darker side of human nature are described by the writer in a detached tone, and to make things worse, characters do not have the power to change their fate. That's called determinism. Key writers include this guy on the left, Émile Zola, who proclaimed that he was the leader of French naturalism. This guy on the right, Stephen Crane, an American writer who believed that the writer has a responsibility to analyse. W.D. Howells, Frank Norris, Theodore Dreiser, who wrote about the environment affecting human behaviour. Other practitioners include Jack London, Edith Wharton, who famously wrote The House of Mirth, and Ellen Glasgow, who wrote Barren Ground. Existentialism, which is pretty much 1850 to present day. Existentialist philosophy believes there is no God. The idea is we're isolated in a chaotic world, coming from nothing and moving towards nothing, and consequently there's no purpose for us being on Earth and no explanation as to why we exist, and therefore our existence is absurd. Quite a depressing view of life. The only way we can come to terms with this is by embracing life, and existentialists believe that because we live in a chaotic world, we can choose to do anything we like. This places a heavy burden of responsibility on us, as we have to make choices based on what we personally believe is right. However, we should not unthinkingly do what is expected of us. We have to define our own meaning in life and try to make rational decisions despite living in an irrational universe. The philosophy's roots lie in the 19th century, with philosophers like this guy on the screen, Friedrich Nietzsche. In the early 20th century, writers and philosophers around the world explored existentialist ideas. Key figures include Lev Shestov in Russia, Gabriel Marcel in France, Karl Jaspers in Germany, and a number of Spanish writers as well, whose names I cannot possibly pronounce, but who you can have a look at in the ebook. Now, as a literary movement, existentialism, can't even say that word, peaked in France after World War II, spearheaded by two famous French writers, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. Now, Sartre's books about existentialism include Being and Nothingness and Existentialism and Humanism. Common themes in existential literature are dread, boredom, alienation, nothingness, the absurd, commitment, and freedom. Sartre's famous works of fiction include The Age of Reason, No Exit, Nausea, and The Wall, whilst Camus's best works include The Fall, The Stranger, and The Plague. Lots of these writings, of course, are very depressing to read, but very interesting literary movement nonetheless. In the 21st century, you might read a text which combines elements of existentialism and postmodernism. Struggling to say that word, aren't I? Here's a lady we saw a couple of videos ago, the Bloomsbury Group, 1912 to 1940s. Doesn't quite fit the Victorian or modernist literary movement. This small and informal Bloomsbury Group contained roughly a dozen artists, writers and politicians who lived or worked in Bloomsbury in central London. Their friends often met to share their thoughts about a range of subjects. They agreed with the philosopher George Edward Moore, who stated that you don't have to prove to other people that an idea or feeling is right and good. The Bloomsbury Group applied this concept, called intrinsic worth, to their discussions. Their ideas about society were radical and shocking for the time. They questioned the tradition of monogamous marriage. Some had openly sexual relationships with other people in the group, and they did not criticize homosexuality. Naturally, the tabloid press had a field day publishing stories about their unconventional relationships. The group also revelled in criticising the establishment. They passionately voiced their views about world peace and social issues, and some members led anti-war movements. If the group had a leader, it was of course this lady, the feminist, novelist and essayist Virginia Woolf. Other members included her brothers Adrian and Toby Stephen, her sister Vanessa Stephen Bell, and her brother-in-law Clive Bell, her husband Leonard Woolf, and critic and biographer Gilles Lytton Strachey, famous for landmarks of French literature and eminent Victorians. Later, the novelist E.M. Forster, from A Passage to India, joined the group, and the noted economist John Maynard Keynes was also a member. In 1917, Woolf and her husband founded a publishing company called the Hogarth Press, which supported writers such as T.S. Eliot, and the group began to decline in the 1930s when its members began to die, and Virginia Woolf, of course, drowned herself in 1941. Finally then, the Beat generation of the 50s and 60s, also called the Beat movement, and it's an American social and literary movement that originated in the bohemian artist communities of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York's Greenwich Village. The word beat means exhausted and beaten down, but it also means blessed, and many members were jazz fans, so the word beat also had music connotations. Members of the movement called themselves beatniks to emphasize their lack of conformity. Unlike the Bloomsbury Group, they were not interested in politics or social problems. Instead, their focus was on individual freedom. They meditated on that, they used drugs, they cultivated mystical experiences and rejected the idea of conformity. They dressed and spoke in non-conformist ways. It's only to be expected then that their literature rejected a formal impersonal style. The defining feature of their writing was its impression of spontaneity and improvisation, and for this reason a lot of beat poetry was performance-based and read in public to jazz accompaniment. Key beat writers include William Burroughs, who you can see on the screen, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who you might remember from the poem Two Scavengers in a Truck, Two Beautiful People in a Mercedes, Jack Kerouac and Gary Snyder. But the movement lost its popularity in the 60s. Well, what next? We have looked at literary movements that might have influenced writers' choices of style and theme. When you're reading a text, you need to look for clues with language, style and theme that might link it to a particular movement. Then use these to stimulate your research and wider reading so that you can discuss the extent to which your writer shares characteristics with the literary period. Hopefully you found that interesting. Please do subscribe to the channel.